You can hear me, and thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for everybody who's joined this evening to hear a bit more about my work and what I'm doing in my sort of PhD journey and my PhD research. So yes, so I'm Alysha Thompson. I'm a third year PhD student at the Institute for Global Food Security at Queen's University Belfast, and my PhD project is focusing in on plant-based diets, dietary patterns, and risk of major chronic diseases and mortality, mostly using data from the UK Biobank study. So my sort of previous degree, my undergraduate degree and integrated master's, was in food science and food security with nutrition. And with that, I got a bit of experience in the food industry as well. So this led me on to sort of pursue my research interests in looking at nutrition and diet and looking at disease prevention, which has led me here today to talk a bit more about my work. So I'll get stuck in and just talk a bit about, firstly, the learning outcomes of this webinar. Hopefully from this webinar, hopefully you learn a little bit more about the Plant-Based Diet Index, which is sort of a key theme in my PhD research, and how it's used to assess plant-based diet quality. Secondly, I hope that you'll learn a bit more about the relationship between healthful and unhealthful plant-based dietary pattern and risk of major chronic diseases and mortality in a UK population. And then at the end, I'll talk a bit more about the current evidence on a more broad spectrum that supports the role of plant-based diets in disease prevention. So the challenge, currently one of the main challenges we face globally is to feed 9.8 billion people in 2050 with a healthy and sustainable diet. The Eat Lancet Commission have proposed an approach to tackle this challenge whereby we change our current diets to more healthy and sustainable ones. And the Eat Lancet Commission have proposed that this may avert of around 11 million premature deaths per year. The Eat Lancet Commission suggests that this diet is rich in plant-based foods and demonstrates both better health and environmental outcomes, reducing overall environmental footprints, and emphasis has been placed on the planetary health plate. And you can see this in figure 1. And the general consensus around these dietary recommendations points towards a shift in consumption in meat, sugar and refined grains to decrease these by around 50%. And you can see in the plate that 50% of the plate is made up of whole grains, fruits and vegetables. A further challenge we face is our aging population, and the global population of individuals aged 65 and above is due to rise to 1.5 billion by 2050, and this is projected to substantially increase further. So coinciding with this, major illness in the UK is predicted to rise at a concerning rate, and currently 1 in 6 individuals are suffering from major illness, but this is expected to rise to 1 in 5 by 2050. A major contributor to major chronic diseases and illness are unhealthy diets, unfortunately, which are estimated to contribute to over 75,000 premature deaths per year in the UK. And you can see in figure 2, this sheds light on the leading dietary risk factors for deaths globally in 2017. And these Lancet findings showed higher sodium and low whole grain intake to be key emerging factors and contributed most to primary and were primary contributors to death, impacting not only global but also specific countries. This figure also shows that the leading causes of death due to unhealthy diets were in fact CVD, cancer and type 2 diabetes. So from these statistics that I've summarized here, it's quite evident that a shift in dietary patterns are needed to lower major chronic disease risk, especially among high income populations. The question is, which diet is most beneficial for human health? And if we had that answer, it would be fantastic, but unfortunately we don't, and that's why this research is so important. So many diet qualities currently exist, including the Alternative Healthy Eating Index, dietary approaches to stop hypertension, the Mediterranean Diet Score, and of course, the Plant-Based Diet Index, which is a key theme in my research. All of these diet quality indices share several characteristics, including the fact that they generally promote whole grain intake, fruits and vegetables, nuts and legumes, and recommend lowering red and processed meat, refined grains, and sugar sweetened beverages. And you'll hear throughout my presentation, I will keep drawing back to these sort of shared characteristics across a healthy dietary pattern and how important these recommendations are. So to coincide with global environmental and sustainability goals, we decided to further investigate the associations between the plant-based diet index and mortality and major chronic disease risk. So this investigation is particularly important due to the disparity that exists between type and frequency of plant food consumption and risk of diseases, which has been observed in previous population-based studies. And you can see in the picture on this slide, you can see that there are two different types of plant-based diets shown on the screen. Both are not equally healthy. And that's just to emphasize that just because you consume a plant-based diet doesn't necessarily mean that it's a healthy one. So referring back to the plant-based diet index, again, a key theme of my research, I just want to talk a bit about what it is and how it's used in research. So it's a plant-based diet scoring system, and it provides a way of scoring data collected from these studies, the dietary data from the studies. So this scoring system was originally created by Satika et al. In 2016 and has been used quite frequently since then in a number of large cohort studies. So you can see in the table on the screen the different food groups that fall into the plant-based diet indices. So the PDI, or the plant-based diet index, is made up of 18 food groups containing several food items in each. The food groups cover healthy plant foods, unhealthy plant foods, and animal-derived foods. And you can see the different food groups listed within. The intakes of the 18 food groups are then calculated and ranked into quintiles of intake. So quintile 1 of a food group would mean that that individual would have a low intake, and quintile 5 would indicate the highest intake of that food group. So depending on the index used, positive or reverse scores would then be assigned to the healthy plant food groups, unhealthy plant food groups, and the animal-derived food groups. So to give you an example of how each of the indices are scored, I'll just go through each of them and how the food groups are scored. So whenever I refer to the PDI, HPDI, UPDI, I'm referring to the plant-based diet index, healthful plant-based diet index, and the unhealthful plant-based diet index. It gets very wordy after a while, and I'm sure you'll be fed up listening to me explaining that. So the PDI includes assigning positive scores to all plant foods. So positive score is assigned to healthy plant foods and unhealthy plant foods, and then negative scores or reverse scores are assigned to animal-derived foods. And whenever I mention negative scores, this means that I assign the scoring system in reverse. For example, in this case for the PDI, animal-derived food groups will be assigned a score of 5 for intakes in the lowest quintile, and then a score of 1 for intakes in the highest quintile. The HPDI in this case involves assigning positive scores to healthy plant foods and negative scores to less healthy plant foods and animal-derived foods. And then for the UPDI, the less healthy plant foods are scored positively, and then healthy plant foods and animal-derived foods are scored negatively or in the reverse. So with that being said, this presentation again covers a number of project findings from my PhD research so far, and the overarching aim of my research is to address whether dietary factors play an important role with respect to risks of major chronic diseases, mortality and disease-free, as well as overall life expectancy and survival, with a specific objective to examine whether healthful versus unhealthful plant-based dietary patterns are associated with mortality and a series of major chronic diseases using data from the UK Biobank. So as I've just mentioned, my research is primarily using data from the UK Biobank. So what is this? So the UK Biobank is a large population-based prospective cohort study of over 500,000 study participants aged between 40 to 69 at recruitment. And these participants were recruited from the United Kingdom between 2006 and 2010 across 22 assessment centres. And this was to provide socioeconomic and ethnic heterogeneity. So at recruitment, all of the participants were required to sign to provide electronic signed consent. And this was to allow the UK Biobank to follow up through their health and medical records or to recontact them for further information if required. So at recruitment, all of the study participants completed a baseline assessment, and this involved carrying out an extensive touchscreen questionnaire, which asked questions on diet, lifestyle, medical history. Physical measurements were carried out, so anthropometric measurements, waist circumference, and height, etc., to calculate BMI. And then biological samples were also collected, so blood and urine samples, for example. And then ongoing enhanced data collection has also been carried out on smaller subsets of the cohort, and examples of these measures, and these measurements are still ongoing in a lot of these subsets. So examples of these measures include cognitive function and hearing tests, multimodal imaging, genotyping data, and of course the 24-hour Oxford WebQ dietary questionnaire. So this project emphasises on using the UK Biobank dietary data, as I have mentioned. And as shown in figure 3, but this shows the timeline of dietary assessment measurement in the UK Biobank, because it's not an easy timeline. It's quite a tricky one with lots of different time points. But to sort of summarise quickly, the touchscreen questionnaire, as I mentioned, was completed by all of the participants at baseline. And in this questionnaire, participants were answered questions on diet and lifestyle. And this was a very minimalistic questionnaire on diet. And it asked around 18 or 29 questions on diet and 18 questions on alcohol. The questionnaire asked about the frequency of consumption over the past year. So in 2009, the study protocol was then modified to substitute the touchscreen questionnaire with the web-based 24-hour Oxford WebQ dietary assessment. And this was a far more detailed and comprehensive assessment that asked about 206 foods and 32 beverages, so far more detailed. The Oxford WebQ has now been sent out to participants on 4 different occasions outside of the recruitment period. So this has allowed up to 210,000 study participants to have completed at least one dietary assessment, which is fantastic, and it's a really great resource to have from the UK Biobank. Although not all participants have completed it, it's a really great subset to have. So looking more specifically at the work that has been conducted by myself and my research group at Queen's, last year we published a study in JAMA Network Open on the associations between plant-based diet index and risk of mortality and major chronic diseases. So I'll just talk a bit more about the methods now and a bit about the results, and just to show you what these look like. So for this study, we again used the Oxford WebQ data from up to 126,000 study participants with a minimum of 2 assessments. However, we calculated the PDI from the Oxford WebQ dietary assessment. However, we couldn't include all 18 of the food groups from the PDI, as unfortunately vegetable oils were not reported in the Oxford WebQ dietary assessment. So we had to exclude vegetable oils from the score. So participants with intakes of more than 0 portions were ranked into quartiles of intake for each of the 17 food groups. For positive scores, participants were assigned a score between 2 and 5 for each food group. Those intakes, or those with intakes of 0 were assigned a score of 1. For reverse scores, the scoring pattern was inverted. To calculate the HPDI and UPDI, the scores were assigned each participant across the 17 food groups and then summed and then categorized into sex-specific quartiles. So as I mentioned there, participants with 0 intakes were assigned a score of 1. So you may be questioning why we have sort of adjusted our method to factor this in. So in the UK Biobank, the Oxford WebQ dietary data is brilliant. However, a lot of the participants reported having consumed 0 portions for many food items. So in order for us to maximize our sample and to make sure we weren't excluding half of the people who completed an Oxford WebQ dietary assessment, we thought to score those who consumed or reported consuming 0 portions with a 1, and that meant that we weren't disqualifying people because of this, because they may have consumed 5 portions of one food item and then 0 of another, and we didn't want to disqualify them based on this alone. So Cox proportional hazard regression models were carried out to estimate hazard ratios and 95% confidence intervals. Our outcomes for this study included mortality, including overall and cause specifics, so CVD and cancer mortality. We looked at overall cardiovascular disease, so total myocardial infarction, ischemic stroke, and hemorrhagic stroke. We looked at total cancer, breast, prostate, and colorectal cancer, and then we looked at fracture, including total, vertebra, and hip. So here you can see a forest plot where we carried out our multivariable Cox proportional hazard regression models with a range of 10.6 to 12.2 years of follow-up depending on the outcome. Greater adherence to the HPDI was significantly associated with a 16% lower risk of total mortality, a 7% lower risk of total cancer, and an 8% lower risk of total CVD. And although not shown in this presentation, higher HPDI scores were also associated with lower risks of myocardial infarction and ischemic stroke. So really great findings, as you can see in the forest plot. In contrast to this, higher UPDI scores, so those who had a higher consumption of unhealthy plant foods, were associated with greater risks of total mortality, total cancer, and total CVD, with increasing risks for total mortality being 23%, 10% higher risks for total cancer, and 21% higher risks for total CVD. So actually, significantly increasing risks when participants consumed higher intakes of unhealthy plant foods. It must also be noted that no significant associations were found between the greater HPDI and UPDI scores and risk of fracture. So this was actually a really interesting finding to have, because previous population-based studies have suggested that a plant-based diet or a vegan diet may increase the risk of fracture through sort of decreased bone density. And this is through not consuming enough calcium, vitamin D, etc. in the diet. So this was quite interesting to find that there was no association between a plant-based diet and fracture at all in this study. So we also carried out further subgroup analyses looking at the HPDI and risk of cardiovascular disease among those with low, medium, and high genetic predisposition to total CVD and myocardial infarction. We looked at those separately. So results showed an 8% lower risk of incident CVD and a 9% lower risk of myocardial infarction among those with high genetic risk to CVD and MI when higher adherence to the HPDI was achieved. So again, another interesting finding, although only among those with high genetic risk to cardiovascular diseases, it was interesting to find that this subset of people still benefit from consuming a healthful plant-based diet, even though their genetic predisposition to the disease was high. So moving on to type 2 diabetes, another sort of key theme in my PhD research. So type 2 diabetes remains a global health challenge with millions of lives affected annually, as many of you will know. As shown in figure 4, type 2 diabetes remains a significant non-communicable disease, ranking among the top 4 and contributing to over 4 million diabetes deaths annually. And when comparing the prevalence rate of type 1 and type 2 diabetes in the forecast until 2040, type 2 diabetes is presenting in the population at an exponential rate, as you can see in figure 4. So key modifiable risk factors for type 2 diabetes include overweight and obesity, which are greatly influenced by dietary intake, making these crucial targets for primary prevention. So following this, we decided to assess the associations between the plant-based diet index and risk of type 2 diabetes in this middle-aged cohort, the UK Biobank. And we recently published our findings in Diabetes and Metabolism late last year. Last year, 2023. I don't know what year I'm in anymore. So for this study, again, we used the Oxford WebQ dietary data from up to 113,000 participants with a minimum of 2 dietary assessments. Using the same scoring system as mentioned previously, associations between the healthful and unhealthful plant-based diet indices and type 2 diabetes risk were analysed using multivariable Cox proportional hazard regression models, followed by causal mediation analyses. And this was to investigate whether or which cardiometabolic risk factors explain the observed associations. So you can see here the results in a forest plot of the 113,000 study participants. 2,628 developed type 2 diabetes over 12 years of follow-up. Participants with the higher or the highest HPDI scores had a 24% lower risk compared to those with lower scores. In contrast, participants with higher intakes of unhealthy plant foods, so a higher UPDI, had a 37% higher risk of type 2 diabetes compared to those in the lowest groups. We also carried out a food-based analysis, looking at which specific food groups in the PDI may be contributing or driving these associations. So on the food group level, vegetables as well as tea and coffee consumption were inversely associated with type 2 diabetes risk. And you can see here, I've inserted the portions per day that seem to be most beneficial for these results. And you can see that actually higher intakes of refined grains, potatoes, sugary drinks, and meat increase the risk of type 2 diabetes significantly. So on systematically removing each food group from the HPDI and UPDI, there was no indication that the observed associations were driven by one specific food group, which highlights that actually this plant-based diet index, or this dietary pattern in general, has a synergistic effect against type 2 diabetes. So yeah, if you have a look at the portions per day, I mean, 6 portions per day of tea and coffee, it would be no problem for me. But these portions are quite reasonable. So 4 portions per day of vegetables showed to decrease the risk of type 2 diabetes by 20%. So I think sort of translating these portions into a real life circumstance actually it's easier to understand what these results mean, and maybe makes it a bit easier for you to take on these sort of recommendations in daily life. So on carrying out mediation analyses, the associations between the HPDI and type 2 diabetes risk was predominantly mediated by lower body fatness, more specifically by lower BMI and lower waist circumference. And the proportions mediated for both of these measurements were 28%, so quite high. Other mediators included HbA1c, IGF-1, inflammatory markers, and markers of kidney function and liver function. So regarding the UPDI and type 2 diabetes, only BMI and triglycerides and waist circumference showed to statistically mediate effects, with proportions mediated of 7, 13 and 17% respectively. And I know I haven't showed the UPDI results on this slide, as I just thought it would maybe be too many numbers to take in for this time of the night. So moving on, and to complement the previous studies, our group also investigated the relationship between the plant-based diet index and incident Parkinson's disease in the UK Biobank. So again, plant-based diets have been associated with lower risks of several chronic diseases, but the relationship between plant-based diets and Parkinson's disease was unknown, which led us to undertake this study, which was published in Movement Disorders last year. So talking a bit about the results again, so of approximately 126,000 participants, 577 developed Parkinson's disease over 12 years of follow-up. Participants with the highest HPDI scores had a 22% lower risk of Parkinson's disease compared to those with the lowest scores. And in contrast, participants in the highest UPDI quartile had a 38% higher risk of Parkinson's disease compared to those in the lowest. So in general, higher PDI scores were associated with an 18% lower risk of Parkinson's disease. And this was actually quite an interesting finding because unlike the previous studies, where no associations were found between overall PDI and the disease, for Parkinson's disease, overall consumption of plant foods was associated with an 18% lower risk of incident Parkinson's disease. So another interesting finding to have. We also carried out food-based analyses, and lower Parkinson's disease risk was shown for higher intakes of, for people with higher intakes of vegetables. So approximately 3 portions per day showed a 28% lower risk, especially among the food items such as tomatoes, salad, cruciferous vegetables, and carrots. And then nut intake showed to lower the risks of Parkinson's disease by 31%, with participants who consumed at least 0.5 or a half portion of nuts per day. And then tea, of course, showed to lower the risk of Parkinson's disease by 25% among those who consumed at least 5 portions per day. Again, for me, quite achievable. So great to see. We also carried out further subgroup analyses looking at the HPDI and risk of Parkinson's among those with low, medium, and high genetic predisposition to Parkinson's disease. So these results suggest that a higher HPDI might exclusively benefit those with a lower genetic risk to Parkinson's disease. So this is, again, was a great finding, and this would suggest that diet may play an independent role in Parkinson's disease prevention. So all of these studies that I've mentioned so far have all used the UK Biobank data, and this is that they all have several strengths and limitations in common. The strengths of these studies would include the fact that they're all based on data that is prospective and of longitudinal design, with up to now 13 years of follow-up time, which is a really long and great time and a great resource. The UK Biobank is also a huge sample. It has a huge sample of over 500,000 participants, and this contributes to a massive power in our analyses. Again, the UK Biobank collected a wide range of data at recruitment and even now in the smaller subsets, which allows us to look at these risk factors and sort of consider these risk factors as confounding factors in our analyses as well. However, with strengths come limitations. So the limitations of all of these studies are the fact that we use the self-reported dietary data. So again, use of dietary data in these sort of observational analyses is quite controversial at times because of its self-reported nature. So the PDI did use the 24-hour dietary data in the UK Biobank, which may not capture dietary intake over longer periods, as this was a 24-hour recall of diet, and it may not capture those episodically consumed foods such as nuts, seeds, legumes, fish, etc. Although this is the case, we have shown that the PDI shows good reproducibility over time, and it indicates and reflects habitual diet despite the limited number of assessments. Also, to support this and to support the dietary data, because I am all pro dietary data, the Oxford WebQ dietary assessments have been validated against objective biomarkers, and this has shown to have reasonable validity. Again, finally, the UK Biobank is made up of more than 90% of white participants of European ancestry, and this does limit the generalizability of our findings and highlights that the UK Biobank may not be representative of the general UK population. However, I do have to come back with the strength against all of these limitations. It has been stated that in terms of causality, representative populations maybe aren't needed at a sample size as large as in the UK Biobank for these smaller ethnic and more culturally diverse subsets. So, and then lastly, we cannot rule out residual or unmeasured confounding in any of our analyses, again, because of the observational nature of the work. To support the findings that and our work so far, I just thought I'd touch upon a few of the recent studies that have been published, some really great studies that have looked at healthy dietary patterns and risk of disease. Um, this study by Shang et al., published in Nature Communications in October last year, showed a greater adherence to healthy dietary patterns was associated with lower risks of multiple individual chronic diseases. So this was a huge study, a really interesting study, and it looked at 4 different dietary scores. So the alternate Mediterranean diet score, the alternate healthy eating index, the healthful plant-based diet index, which caught my attention, and the anti-empirical dietary inflammatory index. And it looked at these dietary scores against 48 chronic diseases in the UK Biobank, which is just massive. So examples of these diseases were cardiometabolic diseases, cancers, neurological and psychological disorders, respiratory diseases, osteoporosis. The list goes on, but it was really, really interesting. And overall, the study found that a higher alternate Mediterranean diet score was most beneficial with respect to the number of chronic diseases it showed to lower the risk of. However, the alternate healthy eating index, the HPDI, and the anti-empirical dietary inflammatory index were also associated with lowering several chronic diseases. And you can see in the table just the number that each of the diet indices lowered the risk of. So you can see it starts, 32 out of 48, 29 out of 48, and then for the HPDI, 23 out of 48 chronic diseases. It's just a massive number, and it was a really interesting study that I would recommend that you read. Carrying on from this, in addition to this study, this study by Fadness et al. It was published in Nature Food in November last year, and it showed an 8.9 and 8.6 years gain in life expectancy for 40-year-old males and females, respectively, when diet was changed from an unhealthy dietary pattern, so a diet low in intakes of whole grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and fish, to the Eat Well Guide dietary recommendations. So again, I'm talking about the sort of higher intakes are needed of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds. And this study showed that the greatest overall benefit was from consuming more whole grains, nuts, fruits, and less sugar-sweetened beverages and processed meats. So again, this study mirrors what I've mentioned previously in our work in the UK Biobank. So again, really interesting finding with regards to life expectancy. So to sort of finish up, I had to showcase this study, of course, a study of gold standard design, this randomized controlled trial on the cardiometabolic effects of omnivorous versus vegan diets in identical twins. And this was published in JAMA Network Open toward the end of last year. And also a Netflix documentary has been released just there in January. Which is really interesting, that actually this work that you see and read about can actually translate into a Netflix program. So this study included 44 study participants, the final sample of which included 21 pairs of identical twins who were randomly assigned a healthy vegan or a healthy omnivorous diet. So one diet was assigned to one twin. The study ran for 8 weeks, with the primary outcome being change in LDL cholesterol over time. The secondary outcomes were changes in cardiometabolic factors. And the results of this were, after 8 weeks, those on a vegan diet had lower levels of LDL cholesterol, lower levels of fasting insulin, and body weight. And although the study is small and of short duration, these findings are promising and show that a healthy vegan diet has additional health advantages when compared to a healthy omnivorous diet. So again, another interesting study, and I would recommend having a read. So to sort of conclude this webinar, we can summarize from these findings that firstly, not all plant-based diets are healthy, and that greater consumption of healthy plant foods and lower intakes of unhealthy plant foods are associated with lower risks of mortality, cancer, and cardiovascular diseases, irrespective of chronic disease risk factors. And although observational studies play a great role in underlining these relationships between diet and disease, dietary interventions in the form of RCTs are an important next step to confirm the role of plant-based diets in disease prevention. So again, further work assessing diet mortality is also needed in more culturally and ethnically diverse cohorts, as I mentioned previously, to better understand the role that cultural and religious affiliation may play in diet consistency and overall level of adherence to a healthy plant-based diet. So that's all for me. Thank you so much for listening, and I'd be really pleased to take any of your questions. But yeah, thank you all. Rahini, I think you're on mute. Yep.
Yeah, so it really, really helped to have you kind of comb through the data like that. And it was, thank you so much for covering it in so much detail, because I'm sure most of us in this chat have come across this work before. And certainly I know that it's been picked up by the media as well. Right, well, I'll go straight to the Q&A. Okay, we don't have any questions yet, but I certainly have a couple myself. So I'll give everyone a chance to start asking them. I think some people have mentioned it in the chat as well. So firstly, I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in this area, and has it also influenced the way that you eat at all? Were you already eating a certain way beforehand? Would love to hear a little bit about that and how you ended up studying this area.
Yeah, great. So at the moment, I try and eat as a healthy dietary pattern, which, as we can see from the evidence, consists of mostly plant-based foods and whole foods, and trying to avoid these ultra-processed foods. However, I don't want to go into that discussion because that's a whole nother webinar, I'm sure. But yeah, I did my food science degree at Queen's, and within that I carried out a placement in my third year, and actually I worked in the meat manufacturing industry for that year, and although it was a great experience, I was exposed to a lot of this meat production, and for me at that time, I was eating meat a lot, and especially in work with the taste panels, I decided that I needed to make a change. So following on and coming back to university and looking at the research side of things with nutrition, dietary patterns and health, I thought I need to make a change. And now I try and eat mostly plant foods where I can, but I understand it's very difficult sometimes to sort of keep yourself on a strict dietary pattern, which I don't do. But I'm mindful of what foods are most beneficial for my health, and I would be mindful of that. So that's where I'm at now, and that's what's sort of driving this research as well. And that I know this is evidence based, and hopefully other people are now sort of realizing that as well. So
yeah, that's great to hear, and it's super interesting that your kind of experiences in the meat industry sort of shaped your habits as well, and that you kind of try to practice what you preach as well, or what you're researching, and that's super interesting. Obviously, the number one question that I'm sure so many people have when they look at this, and from so many other studies, is about potatoes, because they are a food that come up again and again, and obviously we all consume potatoes in different ways. I'd love to hear your take on that data and why you think that a food that obviously we know is rich in fiber, potassium, vitamin C, gets this result. And this isn't just in your studies, but in a number of other studies as well. So I'd love to hear what your perspective is.
yeah, so whenever I came across the plant-based diet index when I started my research, that was a very alarming thing. As someone from Ireland, potatoes are part of our everyday. So stereotypically, yes, they are. So yes, so potatoes are part of the unhealthy plant food groups, unfortunately. And this is not because the whole potato or the whole food as a potato, it's not necessarily unhealthy, but it's actually how people consume them. So how they prepare them, how they cook them, what they eat them with. So in the UK and we were mindful of this in the UK Biobank as well. Most of the potatoes that are consumed in the UK Biobank are consumed through chips, through frying. They're consumed with a lot of butter, a lot of cheese, it's what's added with them as well. So in the UK Biobank, yeah, these were scored as an unhealthy plant food because of this, because of the preparation steps that usually coincide with their consumption. So yeah, that's a question I get a lot, but hopefully that sort of that gives you a better understanding of why they're scored that way in the plant-based diet index. But also potatoes, in terms of the study of our study that looked at type 2 diabetes, potatoes showed to increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. And that although this may be because of the fried aspect, potatoes have a high glycemic index, and this does spike glucose levels, and this in the risk of type 2 diabetes. You can understand why this may increase the risk. So those are sort of the factors that we considered as well. I know some other groups may decide to change the scoring system for potatoes because it's not necessarily an unhealthy food, but it's not an unhealthy food when considered whole. But when factoring in the preparation and cooking steps, it does unfortunately become unhealthy.
That's such a great explanation. Thank you. I would say that also a quick tip that people can do if they are worried or they've got pre-diabetes or diabetes, or they simply want to maximize the benefits of potatoes, is of course to eat them with their skin on, things like boiling and baking. But another thing is popping them in the refrigerator while they're cooling down, so warm cooling, and then either eating them cold the next day or later on, or reheating them after they've already been cooled, which obviously increases the amount of resistant starch and decreases their glycemic index as well. So and try and pair them with other foods like beans and salad and other fiber and protein rich foods. So it can be a very wholesome food when it's consumed that way. But you're absolutely right. I think the majority is probably roast potatoes and lots of butter and oil and cheese and fries. But probably actually the British food of having a baked potato with and choosing some healthier toppings could actually be quite a good meal. I've certainly found that with my clients. Suddenly there's just this absolute influx of questions, so we'll try and get through them as much as possible. I just want to quickly mention that we have got a webinar coming up on plant-based diets for children with a pediatric dietitian. We also have a plant-based section on our website for people raising plant-based toddlers and children, all vetted by a pediatrician, by pediatric dietitians, lots of fact sheets, supplement advice. You do need to plan any diet that you're feeding, particularly young children, with some attention and consideration needs to be given to nutrients, and that's true as well for a plant-based diet. So please do go and check out those evidence-based resources, because that isn't relevant to this particular study. And there was a similar question, the same one we had with potatoes, about fruit juice and coffee, and why was fruit juice considered unhealthy and coffee considered in the healthy category, whereas often we don't always consider coffee to be a health food. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so with the fruit juices, so we're talking about fruit juices sort of align with almost sugar sweetened beverages. They contain very, very high amounts of sugar, and that's why they were categorized as an unhealthy plant food. And there's a lot of research to support this as well, with fruit juice intake, sugar sweetened beverage intake, these beverages that contain high amounts of sugar and risk of disease. So yeah, maybe I could add a few links or send a few links to these papers. But yeah, that's sort of a solid sort of research finding that people have found previously. So regarding coffee. Yes, so coffee is a healthy plant food. It sort of aligns with the tea drinkers as well. So tea and coffee were combined as one. However, in the Parkinson's analysis, we separated these out because tea actually showed to have a stronger beneficial effect over coffee, and we wanted to see which of the two was driving the association. So coffee contains usually a high amount of polyphenolic acids and compounds. And these have shown to be very beneficial for reducing the likes of cardiovascular disease and other major chronic diseases. And actually, this is an aspect of our research that we are now continuing to look at in the UK Biobank. I'll not talk too much about it, but yes, Professor Aidan Cassidy is an expert in flavonoids, and part of her research is looking at flavonoids and the health effects it has in large cohorts and in large studies. So yeah, these polyphenols are really beneficial for the vasculature, reducing blood pressure. So again, having beneficial effects on cardiovascular disease mostly. So again, there's a lot of studies to support this, that tea and coffee do in fact reduce the risk of these diseases in these observational studies. So hopefully that answers your question.
That's very much in line with what we'd expect. It's the
Yeah.
fruit juices rather than smoothies. Obviously, fruit juices lack that fiber. A lot of it's been removed. And similarly with the coffee, the chlorogenic acid and the other polyphenol content makes sense. Obviously, it would be interesting to know if the tea may be slightly kind of, as you say, you said it's sort of a little bit ahead. Is it because a lot of the coffee consumption also comes with sugar and cow's milk and lots of other things and creamer and things like that. Obviously, a high street frappe is quite different to having a black coffee or a coffee with soy milk.
Yeah, for sure. So processing and heat does affect these compounds in tea and coffee. So adding milk and adding sugar to these drinks can dilute the effect that these compounds have with regards to these health outcomes. But I think I saw someone mention maybe black tea there. So in the UK Biobank, we considered anybody who drank tea at all. So this included adding milk, adding sugar, and the benefits were still found among those who drank, I think it was approximately 5 cups or 6 cups a day. There were still benefits of drinking tea on those outcomes. So yeah, so a lot of studies seem to show that tea and coffee are greatly beneficial for disease prevention. So, and mechanistic studies would suggest that it's down in tea, it's down to the flavonoid compounds, and then in coffee it's more other polyphenols that contribute to these health benefits.
I think they were also asking, did you kind of separate the type of tea as well? Was green tea looked at, or was there just any type of tea came into that? I assume it was all caffeinated tea rather than kind of a peppermint tea or something.
So yeah, so in the plant-based diet index, it's all tea. It was all tea that was considered, and all coffee. So we didn't exclude any type of tea or coffee. It was just all. So the combined effect seemed to be beneficial.
That's super helpful. And as someone else has asked, what results did you find with consumption of fish? Sorry, consumption of fish. Yes. What do you think about that versus the kind of fully whole food plant-based diet? Many recommendations recommend the consumption of fish, but how would you defend the plant-based view?
Yeah, so with the plant-based diet index, it actually is quite similar to the Mediterranean diet score, other than it doesn't score any kind of meat consumption, including fish, positively at all. So other than in the plant-based diet index, we in the UK Biobank, we couldn't include vegetable oils. The Mediterranean diet and the plant-based diet index are very similar, but with regards to fish, in our food-based analyses, we didn't find any significantly inverse associations between fish consumption and the endpoint, specifically any of our endpoints. I think in our Parkinson's disease paper, we found there was a significant trend in fish consumption and risk of Parkinson's disease. However, there was nothing really significant there. So other than that, I don't really know much more about fish consumption. It's not something we've looked at specifically against several endpoints, and I don't know a lot about the evidence to support it, other than the Mediterranean diet score has shown to be very beneficial among similar endpoints that we've looked at. So with regards to sort of the plant-based diet index or using the Mediterranean diet score, I think both of them are go hand in hand and can work together. And I think they're both great diet scores. I think they're both great dietary recommendations. Whether you decide to consume fish or not, I think the whole food sort of side of things, and consuming a diet that is based upon whole food consumption is a good diet to have.
Great, thank you. There's lots of praise for you. Fantastic talk, excellent data, keep spreading the word. Many thanks, Alysha. Very important new findings in these subcategories. Could you expand a little bit on stroke? You sort of, and whether the genetic predisposition can be reduced by a healthy plant-based diet. It seems to confirm Dr. Neil Barnard's words that genes are committees, they advise, not decide. What was the major factor for stroke? Was it sodium or something? Or was there another factor to consider there?
As in when we looked at genetic predisposition.
Exactly, in terms of kind of a dietary, the biggest dietary factor in sort of stroke and stroke prevention.
Yeah, so unfortunately in the UK Biobank, so whenever I'll touch a bit about the genetic predisposition side of things first. Unfortunately, in the UK Biobank, we only looked at genetic predisposition to total cardiovascular disease and then myocardial infarction. And at the time of the analysis, we were provided with these polygenic risk scores from the UK Biobank. So we didn't actually create these ourselves. However, we also can do that in our research group. But the UK Biobank provided this data, open access to us as part of our project to look at the polygenic risk scores. So within that, stroke wasn't a part of that at the time. So unfortunately, we couldn't look at genetic predisposition to stroke on its own. So that's one thing. With regards to diet and stroke, clearly sodium salt intake has previously been associated with increased risk of stroke. We looked at ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke separately in our study. And in the big sort of JAMA paper, we showed there was no association between a healthy plant-based diet and risk of hemorrhagic stroke. However, there was for ischemic stroke for those who consumed higher intakes of healthy plant foods. We didn't find this association between hemorrhagic stroke. I personally think because our sample size was very small. Our case numbers in the UK Biobank for hemorrhagic stroke were extremely low and extremely small, which meant we had very low power in our analysis. I think if we had higher numbers of cases, it's awful to say because you don't want anybody having any type of disease, but in an analysis or a statistics side of things, higher numbers are a great thing. Our case numbers were unfortunately just too low, and I think if the numbers had been higher for hemorrhagic stroke, we maybe would have seen more beneficial healthy effects from consuming a healthful plant-based diet. I hope that's covered. I've probably rambled, but I hope that's covered.
That's been super helpful. Let's just quickly launch a poll before we wrap up. I just want to come back to a couple of comments that were there about the caffeine. I think a couple of people were a bit kind of alarmed that they thought, caffeine is harmful and it can cause heart palpitations. And obviously, we know there's individual variation here as well on how people metabolize caffeine. But what are your thoughts on that and the fact that tea and coffee was still shown to be beneficial? Probably the vast majority of tea and coffee that was consumed was caffeinated, I'm guessing. That's just kind of what you get that's out there. I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, so again, in our Parkinson's disease paper, this was something that came up because caffeine has shown to decrease the risk of incident Parkinson's disease in previous population-based studies. And we sort of wanted to look at this a bit more. And in fact, in our analysis, we did adjust for caffeine intake when looking at, in food group analysis, looking at tea specifically. And we adjusted or considered caffeine intake as a potential confounder because we know it has been shown to have beneficial effects for risk of Parkinson's disease. And I think the mechanisms behind this are related to actually the gut microbiome, and the fact that caffeine has shown to have a beneficial effect on the gut microbiome and sort of mitigating gut dysbiosis. So that's one of the sort of positive sort of research side of things that we've seen with regards to caffeine intake. With other outcomes, I'm really not too well read on that, just because it hasn't been a focus of my PhD research. It's been more whole foods and a plant-based dietary pattern, but a really interesting point to consider.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, with a lot of these things, there's always going to be some individual variation and some other facts to consider, which, yeah, it's not a real kind of just something we can totally generalize, but it's good there is that consistent finding. And I think what your research makes incredibly clear is how important the overall dietary pattern is. So often, and particularly in January, the rhetoric is this particular food is awful, or, you know, this meal is terrible, or I've had eaten too much at Christmas or whatever. But it's that overall dietary pattern that 365 days a year that needs to be considered, and getting more whole plant foods in clearly seems to be kind of a winning answer. And just shifting towards that can have tremendous impact on our health and prevent us from developing, or certainly massively reduce our risk of developing, many of these common chronic conditions. And type 2 diabetes, as you said, is something that is just totally on all over the world. It's something that's just shooting up. So I think it's really important to address that. And often plant-based diets don't get taken into account. It's more of a focus on low-carb diets. So yeah, I think everyone's saying good luck with the rest of your PhD studies. They loved it. And I'm sure we'll definitely have you back in the future to discuss any future research. The things that you've got coming up sound super interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that when you can talk about it. But thank you everyone for joining. And for those who are interested, within the next couple of days, the details of our next webinar will be out on plantbasedhealthprofessionals.com/webinars. And do consider signing up to join us as a member, or keep updated on our future events. And thank you so much, Alysha, and good night, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.